Thanks especially to Amy Durbin, who sent me this invite. I know as long as Amy is working in internet museums, that I will always have a steady stream of invites of places to go and speak. Amy first hosted me at Highland, the home of James Monroe. And I'd written a book, my first book, which was called Founding Rivals, which was about the friendship and rivalry between James Madison and James Monroe and their race against each other for a seat in the first House of Representatives, which resulted in our Bill of Rights. And so I was able to go down there and speak as part of the Virginia Festival of the Book. And Amy and I have remained in touch and remained friends ever since. And she actually reads my books before anybody else does and gives me really, really valuable insight and feedback, and prevents me from making a lot of embarrassing mistakes before they hit the shelves. So I really am grateful to that. So I'm sorry I can't be with you guys in person. You know, one of my favorite parts of these kinds of talks is that I get to visit a new town and see a new museum and a new historic site, and get to experience the local history and heritage. And unfortunately, I'm coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, where it is hotter than the surface of the sun right now, and where I am quarantined in my home. So I appreciate all of you guys joining us. It really is a pleasure to be here. And I'm absolutely going to take you up on that offer to come back and speak for a future project. So I was asked to talk today about a book I wrote called The President's War, 6 American Presidents and the Civil War That Divided Them. One of the questions that you get really often as an author is, how you find the discipline to write, or why do you write? And for me, it was always because there were these stories from history that I wanted to read about and learn everything I could about, but someone had yet to write the book. And so never in any other case was that as true with this book, The President's War. I was in Seattle in 2012, just traveling, visiting the Pacific Northwest, and went to stay with a law school friend of mine who was a big history buff. And we were talking about the presidents and the Civil War, and we were talking about Martin Van Buren being alive at the time of the Civil War. And I said, boy, that's interesting. Martin Van Buren's really not a person you associate with the American Civil War, right? As the architect of the Democratic Party and Andrew Jackson's running mate and vice president. You don't really think about him as a Civil War figure. But, as my friend and I progressed in our conversation, she said, oh, we had a record number of presidents who were alive at the time of the Civil War. And I said, well, that's incredible. I think I've really found the subject for my new book here. And so we had 5 former presidents who were alive at the time of the US Civil War. And people that you would just never associate with the era. Van Buren being one, Tyler is another, and then of course Lincoln's immediate predecessors of Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan. And so I was curious about how they viewed the Civil War. They had a very unique vantage point on things. Each of them, during their time in office, had tried to stop the Civil War from coming about, and each of them in their way had caused the Civil War to come about. And so when the guns started going off and the cannons started firing, I wondered what kind of role that they had played. And it turns out that they were quite active. You know, there was a time in early American history, and actually I got this perspective from John Tyler, where a former president was not even considered, it wasn't considered appropriate for them to walk into Washington, D.C. Because if you remember, our founding fathers had this, the memory of what happened to the last republic, right? The Roman Republic that fell to a dictatorship. The idea that you'd have a former president even stepping foot in Washington, D.C. sounded too familiar to them of some kind of coup or dictatorship or upsetting of the democratic balance and process. And so former presidents wouldn't even set foot in Washington, D.C. In fact, Tyler thought he'd never see the city again. Flash forward to the Civil War, and you've got every president off the bench stating their mind and sharing their opinions and advocating for Americans to take one course or another, or advising and challenging the president to do this or that. So we'll start with Martin Van Buren. He's the earliest of these presidents who survives to see the Civil War. He's also quite sick when the war begins. He was a Democrat, but he had run as a third-party candidate in a previous election on the Free Soil ticket. So later in his career, just becomes very strongly anti-slavery. However, like all the other presidents, he opposes Abraham Lincoln's election to the White House. Lincoln represented a new political party, the Republican Party, and a new paradigm. So even though these other presidents who lived to see the Civil War were members of different political parties and factions within those parties, they all agreed on a certain thing, which was it's the role of the president to contain all of the sectional struggles and difficulties. It's the job of the president to compromise and to bring the factious sections of the country together and avert a sectional conflict. That was all of their viewpoint of the role of the president, whether they were Whigs or Democrats or regardless of what their ideology was within those parties. And so Martin Van Buren had opposed Abraham Lincoln's election as president to avoid triggering a civil war, which was generally thought to be a consequence of the Republicans winning the White House, a sectional party, a northern-only party winning the presidency. However, when Lincoln wins, and when Lincoln first issues the call for troops after the firing on Fort Sumter, Martin Van Buren writes a letter encouraging all single men to answer the president's call and sign up to defend the Union. And it was said that even onto his deathbed, Martin Van Buren brought newspaper articles and asked for briefings on what the status was of the Civil War, remained intensely interested until his death in the middle of the conflict. Then you have John Tyler, who plays a much more interesting and active role in these affairs. So Tyler, one of his nicknames is his accidency. He's the first vice president to become president of the United States during the short-lived tenure of William Henry Harrison. He's put onto the Whig ticket as a balancing figure. It was an intramural squabble between Harrison and Henry Clay for control of the Whig Party. And it was thought that putting Tyler on the ticket would balance and bring the Whig Party together. Martin Van Buren looked so weak at this point as a candidate for re-election after the first national economic crisis that the Whigs didn't even bother adopting a national platform. And so they stayed mum on the issues. They run a war hero. They put Tyler on for balance, and they knock Martin Van Buren out of the White House. Harrison dies shortly thereafter. Tyler had a very different view of things from Harrison. So Tyler is a Southern slaveholder. His view of the Union, which was very consistent throughout his life and career, was that really Congress, DC, our national government was really more like the United Nations, that states were sovereign and that state sovereignty was a good thing, and really favored a very weak national government, more like a debating society that handled national defense. And of course, he'll be kicked out of the Whig Party. Henry Clay engineers a fight between congressional Whigs and Tyler over the National Bank, which Tyler vetoes multiple times. And Henry Clay prevents any sort of compromise, hoping that Tyler will get kicked out of the Whig Party and he'll be able to win the nomination for president next time. So that part works. But when Tyler can't get anything done domestically, as presidents often have done since then, right? When they're frustrated in Congress, they can't get anything done on their domestic agenda, they turn their attention to foreign policy. And back then, the question of what to do about Texas, which had just won its independence from Mexico, was a question of foreign policy, because Texas is an independent republic. It's claimed by the country of Mexico. Tyler spends the rest of his presidency working hard to get Texas into the Union, which really sets us up on a path for war with Mexico, which will begin under his successor, James K. Polk. And so, of course, we have this war with Mexico. We acquire all of this land in the western United States, including where I'm speaking to you right now in Phoenix, Arizona. Of course, anytime the United States acquires new territory, it inherits new problems. So at this point, the Compromise of 1820 had been in place and keeping the country together. Now we've got all this new territory. Is it going to be free? Is it going to be slave? Is it going to be some combination of the same? This question persists to the end of Polk's presidency. In fact, it almost shuts down the government at the end of Polk's presidency. So the last Congress that meets during the presidency of James K. Polk attaches a rider to the budget, trying to make the new territories free. And of course, this causes a huge fight, and the government nearly shuts down, and they reach an 11th hour compromise. And Abraham Lincoln was actually a member of that Congress and voted consistently to shut down the government rather than open any new territory to slavery. So these problems are going to end up in the lap of his successors. Zachary Taylor will win the White House in 1848, but he's not long for the world, and he's replaced by his vice president, Millard Fillmore, who was a former congressman and who'd been most recently serving as the comptroller of New York. Zachary Taylor had been really opposed to any sort of compromise on the issues of slavery. He invited California to come in as a free state. He offered no offsets to the slaveholding states. It looked like very much like there might have been some kind of small sectional conflict, some secession crisis on Taylor's watch, which I think he would have very easily put down as the most popular man in the United States, the most popular man among the military, and also as a Southern slaveholder himself with a lot of credibility on what constituted a fair compromise or not for the slave interests of the country. However, Taylor dies. Fillmore becomes president. Fillmore signals an interest in signing off on a series of compromises, which is known as the Compromise of 1850, mostly incorrectly, because it's a series of bills. It gets passed with a number of congressmen and senators in the center of the political spectrum, with Southern extremists, Northern extremists voting no on each bill, depending on who it favored, and the center voting for every bill. Those bills all go to Fillmore's desk. So it limits the territory of Texas, which is a slaveholding state. It brings in California as a free state, but also creates a much stronger Fugitive Slave Act, which Millard Fillmore said, I knew I was signing my political death warrant, but he thought it was necessary for preserving the Union. And in fact, that Compromise of 1850 will delay the Civil War by a decade and actually give the North the opportunity to grow in population and industrial capacity and ultimately allow it to win the Civil War. So Fillmore's sign off on the Compromise of 1850 actually kills the Whig Party. So back then you had Northern and Southern Democrats, Northern and Southern Whigs. You didn't have regional parties. This compromise is going to change all that and realign the country around a new political paradigm. Fillmore will leave the White House. Franklin Pierce will end up becoming president. So one of the most important things to understand about this time period in history is that the Democratic Party typically won the White House, and to be nominated as the Democratic candidate for president, you had to win something that was called the two-thirds rule. So at every Democratic convention, it wasn't good enough to be the most popular nominee or the most prominent. Actually, it was more helpful for you to be a so-called dark horse candidate because fewer people had any objections to you. So you had to win 2/3 at the conference, and this will persist into the 20th century, 2/3 at the National Convention. And Franklin Pierce had been out of politics for a long time. His wife really hated political life and really hated what she saw the effects of political life were on her husband. And so he was well thought of and fondly remembered as a former senator and congressman, but hadn't been in the spotlight for a long time. He'd served as a general in the war in Mexico. He's going to become president of the United States. Remember, anyone who becomes president under this 2/3 rule, right, gives the South a veto over who that president is. So you have Franklin Pierce, a man from New Hampshire, who is considered a dough-face, right, a Northern supporter of slavery and slave interests. And so Franklin Pierce is really going to get the ball rolling here by signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that repeals the Missouri Compromise, right? The Missouri Compromise says above a certain line, the new territories incorporated as states will be free. Below a certain line, those will be slave. And that balance had kept the country together at that point for 34 years. And Pierce is like, we're going to do away with all that. We're going to let Kansas decide for itself whether to become a free or slave state. So this by itself really shouldn't have been a problem because the overwhelming majority of settlers in the Kansas territory were from the North, many of them from Massachusetts. They supported the idea of a free Kansas. in a fair election, it's no problem. Kansas becomes a free state. However, slave state interests go out of their way to steal the elections by violence and force and really unprecedented levels of fraud, and are able to win control of Kansas territorial government and create a pro-slavery constitution, which the state is then asked to adopt. And of course, this is going to cause really serious tensions throughout the rest of the country. Free states are watching a free territory in the United States be co-opted through violence and election fraud. And the federal government's not doing anything about it. I mean, this seemed to be perfectly okay with President Pierce. He certainly doesn't do anything to try to stop it. He's certainly well aware of what's happening. His own governors of the Kansas territory, it's kind of a revolving door of people. They keep quitting or getting pushed out, saying, look, we've got this problem here. He doesn't do anything about it. Makes him a one-term president. Really destroys the Democratic Party in the North. The North really isn't having this. And Abraham Lincoln, who at this time is simply practicing law in Illinois and has really given up any dreams of being involved in politics, will return to the political arena because the idea of the repeal of the Missouri Compromise had really affected him and impacted him like nothing that he'd before seen in politics. So Pierce becomes a one-term president. The country really isn't sure about these new Republicans. They've got kind of a radical belief, right? They're going to stop territory, hold slave territory to its current boundaries, not allow any of the new territories to be incorporated as slave states. It's really a radical position, most radical position really there was in politics at the time. So they know that electing the Republicans is going to cause a problem, but the Democrats have really screwed up the country. And you've got the Kansas territories on fire, and you've got Americans killing each other in the streets of Kansas. So something's got to give. And the Democrats figure the only way that they could win the 1856 election is to get a Democrat who has nothing to do with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So when Franklin Pierce becomes president, he's the youngest president in American history at that point. He's like 48 years old. And he wanted to be the first president since Andrew Jackson to win a second term. One of the reasons we have so many presidents alive during the Civil War is because they all had short tenures. Pierce thinks he can do it. And his main opponent within the party is James Buchanan. Buchanan's a very senior figure, right? He'd been Secretary of State to Polk. He'd been in the Senate. He'd been in the House, been Jackson's ambassador to Russia. Says, I gotta get Buchanan out of the country. And so he convinces Buchanan to accept this position as ambassador to the United Kingdom. Buchanan doesn't want to go. He knows why Pierce is sending him off there. It's to eliminate him as a presidential rival in 4 years. But actually, the thing that Pierce did to try to send Buchanan into retirement makes Buchanan the nominee 4 years later, because now Buchanan is the most prominent Democrat who's completely untainted by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so Buchanan will return triumphantly to the United States and be elected president, and then will proceed to make every remaining mistake there is to make to usher in the Civil War. First thing he does is actually to lobby the Supreme Court for a really broad decision in a pending case that they have, which you've all heard of, the Dred Scott decision, which will determine that a slave has no rights that the white man is bound to respect, paves the way for allowing slavery into all the new territories of the United States, maybe even eliminating the very idea of free states themselves. I mean, if you could bring a slave into a free state and they don't gain their freedom, in what sense is that? In what sense do you really have a free state? So he lobbies for a very broad decision there, thinking that this would put an end to things. And of course, just the opposite is true. And Buchanan continues to try to force Kansas to adopt the Lecompton Constitution, which was the pro-slavery constitution that was the product of rigged elections. And he tries to force this through Congress. And there he'll run into a roadblock with Stephen Douglas. So Stephen Douglas is actually the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He believed in an idea called popular sovereignty, which means let these new territories decide for themselves if they want to be free or slave. Why are we working this out in Congress and fighting over it in Congress? And so he's watching them make a joke of his popular sovereignty with these rigged elections and corrupt elections. So Douglas opposes President Buchanan in his attempt to bring Kansas into the Union as a slave state. Buchanan will, I think to some degree wrongly, he's rightfully considered as one of our worst presidents, usually for the wrong reasons. Really, Buchanan's great crime is trying to force Kansas into the Union as a slave state over the will of the people of Kansas. This is going to do more than virtually anything to trigger the Civil War. This fight between Buchanan and Douglas gets really ugly. Douglas gets summoned to the White House. Buchanan reminds him of all the bad things that happened to Andrew Jackson's opponents while he was president. So, when Jackson was president, leader of our party, people challenged him, and that was usually the end of their career. And Douglas said, well, let me remind you that President Jackson is dead. And basically, you're no President Jackson. This is going to lead to the breakup of the Democratic Party, which is another condition that was necessary for the Civil War, right? The idea that you have purely sectional parties. And so in the 1860 election, you're going to have Douglas running for president. He can't win that 2/3 at the Democratic convention, even though he's the most popular guy by a mile. The South keeps vetoing him because he wouldn't go along with their plans to hijack Kansas. He runs as the Democratic nominee anyway. There's an extreme slaveholding Southern Democrat, Breckinridge, who is Buchanan's vice president, who gets nominated to run. And so you've got a Northern Democrat, a Southern Democrat running. You have the Constitutional Union Party candidate, who's basically a former Whig, running as a Whig in 1860 when their issues have long since taken a back seat to slavery and sectional conflict. And you have the Republicans turning to Abraham Lincoln, who had distinguished himself in the 1858 Senate race, debating Stephen Douglas on the big issues of the day, becoming probably the most covered story of the year and making Lincoln a household name. And so Lincoln's going to get elected president. Every former president tries to stop him from winning. Millard Fillmore supports the Constitutional Union Party. Franklin Pierce supports Breckinridge. Buchanan really doesn't get involved, but to the extent he does, obviously he's not supporting his archenemy Douglas. He's for Breckinridge. So you got Pierce and Buchanan for Breckinridge. You got Van Buren is for Douglas. Everyone's trying to lock Lincoln out of the Electoral College. In fact, the presidents are trying to figure out how can we combine our anti-Lincoln efforts in the Electoral College and try to flip states against Lincoln, particularly in New York State. They try to lock out New York and try to throw it into the House of Representatives, where they thought they had a better chance. Obviously, they're not successful. John Tyler sees the election of Lincoln. He believes secession is inevitable. James Buchanan's still got a job to do. He's still president of the United States. And so this is where Buchanan will mostly be unfairly remembered for his inactivity at this stage of the game. First of all, he's confronting an unprecedented crisis, right? You have states led by South Carolina and others meeting and announcing that they're leaving the Union, right? Totally unprecedented. But every time we've walked up to the brink in American history, we were able to compromise our way out of things. So there was no reason really to think that this was any different than 1820, than 1850, than 1787. I figured it would be some sort of solution to this, right? And yeah, Buchanan had pro-secession people in the cabinet, but if you're trying to get the states that claim they're seceding to come back into the fold, the exact wrong message to send is to start firing Southern cabinet members, right? And so he's trying to hold it all together. Militarily, there is nothing he can do. He's got 18,000 soldiers under his command. 2/3 of them are west of the Mississippi River, protecting settlers. And even if he'd had them all in one place, that's not enough people to invade South Carolina. And in fact, if he had invaded South Carolina, he would have completely unified the South, including the border states who didn't end up seceding, behind South Carolina, and the war and the Union with it would have been over in pretty short order. And so he turns over to Lincoln a secure capital. He got a lot of heat for bringing so many troops into Washington, D.C., but he said they were for the inaugural parade. And so he was able to turn over a safe Washington, D.C. to Abraham Lincoln, in a country that's in a lot of trouble. But now it's Lincoln's problem. Buchanan tells him, if you are half as happy to enter the White House as I am to leave it, then you're the happiest man in the world. So Buchanan's happy to go back to Wheatland. He thinks Abraham Lincoln is simply going to follow his policy and that Buchanan will be vindicated in the process. Obviously, we know that's not quite what happened. Franklin Pierce travels the country giving speeches saying if the southern states want to leave peacefully, then we need to let them leave peacefully. Really, the reason things got this bad is our fault, those of us in the North, the abolitionists, people like John Brown, who in his famous raid on Harper's Ferry tries to lead a slave uprising by invading Harper's Ferry, and the North's seeming approval of this act, all of the legislation that the North has proposed to try to limit or destroy slavery, the election of Abraham Lincoln. This is really the fault of these northern states. If the South wants to leave peacefully and we can't convince them to stay, we need to let them go. Millard Fillmore, and I wish I could be a fly on the wall for this conversation, Millard Fillmore actually hosted Abraham Lincoln in Buffalo on Lincoln's train trip to Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated as president. We don't, of course, know what they talked about. Fillmore, for his part, will start raising a National Guard unit. You know, we really don't think about Buffalo as being a hotbed of activity in the American Civil War. But remember, the biggest threat, one of the biggest threats anyway, to the survival of the Union during the Civil War is foreign intervention, right? The United Kingdom and France getting involved probably puts an end to the Union. And Canada is still a part of the United Kingdom at this time. So if the United Kingdom were to declare war on the United States, Buffalo would actually probably be the first major city they invaded. So Millard Fillmore's raising of a National Guard unit of men who were too old, like himself, to serve on the front lines was actually a pretty useful thing. So John Tyler, who believed he'd never see Washington, D.C. again, he actually finds a new invigorated role in public life. You know, his last job in politics after leaving the presidency was as roads overseer for his local community in Virginia. His neighbors had done this to embarrass and humiliate him. Tyler, when he leaves the presidency, moves back to his plantation, Sherwood Forest, where his grandsons, his child's children, still alive, still living in Sherwood Forest. Sherwood Forest was surrounded by Whigs, and they hated John Tyler. And so to mock him, they put him roads overseer. They elected him to a position that he was sure he'd have to quit, because it's, how can you go from president to being overseer of roads? So they elected him to embarrass him. And they were surprised when he accepted the role. And the one power you had as roads overseer is that you could requisition people's slaves and have them do road work. And so Tyler actually waits until the height of the harvest season when the slaves are most valuable and most necessary. And he uses his power to requisition everybody's slaves and starts putting them to work on the roads. And so the area has the best roads. And they keep saying, you know, you've done a great job. Maybe you should retire. And, oh, no, I can't possibly think of setting aside this responsibility, this lofty responsibility that you, my esteemed neighbors, have elected me to. Can't say he didn't have a sense of humor or a sense of public duty. And so Tyler is actually running back and forth between the secessionists in South Carolina and the Buchanan White House, trying to hammer out some kind of compromise. Really, what they want is Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie turned over to the new country of South Carolina. And so Buchanan, trying to work things out. He'll continue this role. He will end up going to DC and chairing something that becomes known as the Old Gentlemen's Convention at the Willard Hotel, where you have a bunch of really old retired senators, congressmen, governors who decided that they would all get together and meet in a room and try to hammer out a compromise. And the compromise they come up with is to just take the Missouri Compromise line and draw it to the Pacific Ocean. And so you have slavery in the New Mexico territory. So where I'm at now in Arizona, in the state of New Mexico, you're gonna have slavery, but above that Missouri Compromise line, you won't have slavery. But the Republican platform was specifically opposed to opening new territory to slavery. That was what Lincoln had run on. That's what he'd been elected to do. And so there was no compromise to be had there. And so he's going to reject the proposals of the Old Gentlemen's Conference. Tyler will shift gears from trying to keep the country together to trying to break it apart. So Tyler joins the Virginia Secession Convention and is actually one of the most frequent speakers and most influential delegates to the Virginia Secession Convention. And his efforts to bring Virginia out of the Union don't go anywhere until Fort Sumter is fired upon. And, once that happens, there really is a kind of rally around the flag mentality in the South that, okay, we're at war now and we really do need to pick a corner and there's no real middle ground to be had. And so even as Lincoln is trying to keep Virginia in the Union, he's got a former president in John Tyler trying to rip it apart. And so throughout the war, Lincoln's going to be dealing with his predecessors, whether he likes it or not. Franklin Pierce will continue to campaign through the country for anti-war Democrats. So even going so far as to manage the anti-war Democrats running for office in New Hampshire, trying to undermine the war effort politically and trying to remove financial and political support for Lincoln and the war. Millard Fillmore, in addition to raising his National Guard unit, ends up being one of the most prominent supporters of widows and orphans and wounded soldiers in the Civil War, who had the largest charitable organization in American history up to that point, mostly to benefit the widows and orphans of the Civil War. Pierce will really become disgraced as a result of his campaigning against Lincoln. Just shortly before Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Pierce will give a speech saying the war is over and it's really time to throw in the towel. Of course, once Vicksburg and Gettysburg happen, the war is mostly over. The South loses its ability to fight offensively and gets cut in half. And so no one's really interested in Franklin Pierce's opinion from that point forward. Fillmore really will support Lincoln, and Buchanan really will be supportive of Lincoln's course of action. He says, Lincoln's just doing what I would do. I really laid the blueprint for Lincoln here, and he's going to vindicate me. But when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he now has every president against him once again. So Van Buren's passed by this point. Presumably he would have favored the Emancipation Proclamation. But all the other presidents are saying, you're crazy. Your whole job as president is to try to keep the country together no matter what. And Lincoln's position, of course, is I'm going to keep the country together, and we're going to be faithful to the principles that I've campaigned on and held my entire political life. And so Lincoln's ultimately able to overcome the objections and the old paradigm that had been established by his predecessors. So no more is it just the role of the president to try to make concessions to the South or the Southern interest, but really as a powerful national leader who's to set the course, the morals for the nation. And so this is a fascinating story. You don't really get many opportunities to see the Civil War through a fresh set of eyes, and really through such a distinguished set of eyes as our former presidents. But that was certainly the privilege I had in writing this book. And so you guys have been really good about listening, but you probably have lots of questions. And really, this is your time. I'm delighted that you're here and that you signed up for this. And so I want to leave time for as many questions as possible. And so thank you guys for listening. But now the floor is your guys to ask me whatever you want to about this book, my other books, process of writing, whatever's interesting to you.
Great, thank you so much. I see one person has unmuted. Do you want to go ahead if you have a question? Katie, there's maybe just unmuted. Feel free to unmute yourselves, or you can type it into chat. I'll start off if you don't mind. I was curious, just at the end, you're talking about Buchanan sort of campaigning for the Democrats almost against Lincoln. Did he and the others continue to campaign against Lincoln for his second term as well, like when the general was running against him? They
did, yeah. So Buchanan supported McClellan. Fillmore supported McClellan. It's not that surprising that the Democrats would support McClellan, particularly Pierce, who was just so virulently against what Lincoln was doing. But Fillmore was a former Whig, really politically much closer to Lincoln. But what Fillmore couldn't abide was the Emancipation Proclamation. This idea that Lincoln had taken a war that was ostensibly about keeping the Union together and repurposed as a fight against slavery. So he thought, you've extended the mandate of the war, and really you've forced the war to go on longer, right? I mean, now you've made it impossible for the CSA to surrender on any sort of terms now that you've ostensibly freed every slave in the Confederacy. So yeah, they all opposed him for re-election. So you had Van Buren and Fillmore and Buchanan supporting his call for troops, supporting the idea to pursue the CSA militarily. But by the time the Emancipation Proclamation comes, he's lost everybody again.
Wow. I recall reading an anti-Lincoln essay about how he represented a Kentucky slave owner who was seeking the return of his escaped slaves from Illinois. And that was cited as evidence that he was an opportunistic, unprincipled politician. How would you react to that?
Sure. So it's interesting. I actually, because everyone's trapped at home and we all need, I'm an attorney, we need continuing legal education credits. I decided I would teach a class I've always wanted to teach, which is the ethics of Abraham Lincoln Esquire. And every year we need 3 hours of ethics. And so ethics credit is really, really highly sought after. And I figured I could get a really good attendance for it. And I did. So we had a Zoom conference on this. And so I talked about this. So Lincoln represented a lot of people whose beliefs he didn't agree with. I think I'll just back up and talk about Lincoln on slavery in general. So Lincoln writes a letter during the Civil War and he says, "If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong, and I cannot remember a time when I did not so think and feel." And when he writes those words are accurate, right? Those words are borne out by everything he did up to that point in his life. So he experienced slavery very early, growing up in Kentucky and in Indiana, and in working as a flatboat hand, going down to New Orleans, which was the largest slave market in the United States at the time, and seeing it firsthand and really, really troubling him, and then serving as a member of Congress. And, from the floor of the House of Representatives, Lincoln could look out and see slave pens. So he'd be on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1847 and 1848 debating the Constitution, freedom, and liberty. And you could look out the window and literally see human beings being held in bondage in the site of the Capitol. And Lincoln had a black servant in the house where he lived. It was the servant that worked for everyone in the house and served meals. And he was working toward buying his freedom, as were all the people who worked in that house. And he was actually kidnapped and sold into slavery. And so Lincoln really saw and experienced firsthand the horrors of slavery. So let's look at Lincoln politically, right? What he did politically and the issue of slavery. Illinois really is a slave state at the time. It's hard to imagine because I'm a native of Illinois. I'm from Chicago. We don't think of Illinois as being a slave state. We really don't think about Illinois at all, except for Chicago. And there's a lot of people who don't live in Chicago or anywhere near it. But Illinois is a southern state at the time. Really, Black people could go to Illinois and sign a contract they couldn't read and be held in indentured servitude for the rest of their life. So the Liberator, which was the leading abolitionist newspaper in the country, said Illinois is a slave state. Illinois is also settled from the south to the north. So most of the people living in Illinois in the antebellum era are from places like Kentucky, people like Abraham Lincoln. So culturally, politically, Illinois is really a slave state. In the Illinois legislature, there were a series of pro-slavery resolutions, and Lincoln voted against every single one of them. He was one of a very small minority, and the only other people who voted against those with Lincoln were people whose careers were basically over. They weren't seeking re-election, they were older, they weren't seeking higher office. For a young, upwardly mobile politician like Abraham Lincoln, that could have been a death sentence, but he voted against those resolutions anyway. Flash forward to his time in Congress. He actually sponsored a bill to emancipate all the slaves in the District of Columbia, which is the only place where Congress has the authority to emancipate slaves, right? The place where it has general jurisdiction, the District of Columbia, maybe soon to be the new state of Columbia. But Lincoln votes for the Wilmot Proviso, which is one of the most divisive issues of the antebellum era, which keeps slavery out of the new territories. Lincoln votes to shut down the government rather than have it open those new territories to slavery. He votes in the Pacheco slave case, that a person can't have a property right in another human being. So really quickly, if you look at like most bills in Congress at this era are bills to give people money. So at the time, their interpretation of the Constitution was that only Congress can spend money, right? So you can't sue the government. The courts can't award you money if you're suing the government. Only Congress can spend money. Now we have the U.S. Court of Claims that adjudicates disputes against the United States. You used to have to go to your congressman. And so there was a slave named Pacheco who was loaned out to the U.S. Army during the Seminole War. He managed to use the opportunity to escape. This family said to the U.S. government, hey, you owe us money for this slave. And so this had been a hotbed issue in every Congress because they keep going back to Congress and demanding money for the property that they lost. So Lincoln votes against the Pacheco family, votes against their ability to own a compensable interest in another human being. So all throughout his career, he acts on these anti-slavery principles, even when they are highly disadvantageous to him. So why does Lincoln end up representing a slave master in Illinois who was trying to prevent his slave from being declared a freeman? Essentially, it was a matter of legal ethics that you took the first person who hired you. So these lawyers would travel town to town, and people be waiting for the lawyers to come with the judge on the circuit. And they'd say, hey, I've got a dispute, I'm being sued, or I want to sue somebody. And really ethically, you were supposed to take the first person who hired you. And so that's really all Lincoln did in this case. So, rather than looking at that lawsuit, he represented people who were trying to get their slaves back. In this case, he represented people on the other side of the coin. Lincoln is an activist politician, but he's not an activist lawyer. And really no such thing exists where you have an activist lawyer where they only take certain kinds of cases, right? Clarence Darrow, for instance, would have never prosecuted a death penalty case. His big issue was eliminating the death penalty. He was a cause lawyer. And so Lincoln's a cause lawyer, but not a cause politician. I'm sorry, he's a cause politician, but he's not a cause lawyer. So if that answers your question.
We have one that came in on the chat, if I can read it for you. This is from
please.
Brian. Brian asks, do you think a second Tyler term would have accelerated the start of the war? Did any ex-presidents voice any regret for not doing enough during their term to mend the country?
No, shockingly, all these presidents really seemed to feel, at least outwardly, that they'd done everything right. They weren't able to look back on their mistakes. Buchanan never looks back on the Dred Scott decision or the Lecompton Constitution or trying to shoehorn Kansas in as a slave state when clearly the people wanted to have a free state. They never look back on those things and say, boy, if only. Fillmore, I think more than anyone, delayed the start of the Civil War. I think Fillmore is actually a very good president. It's just that some of the bills he has to sign to delay the Civil War will end up really stoking Northern resentment. And I'll give you an example. Signing that enhanced Fugitive Slave Act prevented the Civil War from happening in 1850 when it could have gone any one of a number of ways. But it really, really created resentment in the North because now they had the power of the federal government behind them when retrieving fugitive slaves. And so actually Northern states start adopting something called personal liberty laws, where they say, you know what, we've got no authority to frustrate the army when it comes to town, but you're not going to use our sheriffs, our police, our jails, and our courts to retrieve slaves. So it's always funny to me when people talk about the start of the Civil War. They say, well, it's really not about slavery, it's about states' rights. That actually makes them wrong on both counts. Because and all anyone has to do is go look at the South Carolina Declaration of Causes of Secession. They say for themselves why they're leaving. They actually say it's not only just about slavery, but it's because states have adopted these personal liberty laws, states like Massachusetts. And so really Massachusetts has the states' rights position to say, we're not going to help you get your slaves back. That's the states' rights position. South Carolina's crying because they're not seeing what they believe is an energetic enough response from the federal government to come in and help them retrieve fugitive slaves. So, but again, it's gonna really stoke the fires between North and South and really give South Carolina ultimately the reason that they used to leave the Union. Franklin Pierce, absolutely recalcitrant to the end of his life, believed he'd done everything right, regretted that the Union had won, regretted that slaves had been freed in the bargain. Really, really an inscrutable guy. I don't know what created his affinity or indifference to slavery, but it's hard to read it any other way. And, they all really thought that they had done the best they could. I wonder, a second Tyler term, see, what would Tyler have a second Tyler term. Well, I think we probably would still end up going to war with Mexico, right? Because Mexico still was claiming Texas as part of the country, even though they had been fairly defeated in a revolution, even though they really had no reason to believe that they were the rightful rulers of Texas. So I think Tyler would have done everything he could. It really was his single-minded focus in the last year of his presidency, was bringing Texas into the Union. And so he would have done so, and I don't think he would have hesitated to go to war with Mexico over them. So what does that look like? We probably do end up with all these territories in the West. I think he's probably a lot like Polk, right? I think Polk in a lot of ways really serves out the second Tyler term, and maybe Tyler would have been a little bit less successful about adjusting the Northwest boundaries with the United Kingdom. Remember 5440 or fight? We ended up settling for a lot less than 5440 and didn't fight there. But I think Tyler's second term would have just looked a lot like Polk's, and we would have ended up in a similar position in 1848, where you've got this war with Mexico that had dragged on for so long, and you've got all this new territory, and we don't know what to do with it. And so that's what I think would have been the case with a second Tyler term. So that's a really good question. Both of those really good questions. Thank you.
Stephen Douglas had won the presidency. What would the world look like?
That's so fascinating. If Stephen Douglas had won the presidency, so if we look at Douglas during his presidential campaign, at a certain point figures out that Lincoln's going to win and that he has no actual path to victory. And so he does one of the most noble and underrated things that anyone ever did in American history. He actually goes to the South, where he has no chance of winning any states from Breckinridge, and gives a series of speeches encouraging them to stay in the Union and telling them that losing an election, especially when you've won nearly every election, is not a cause for taking your ball and going home. And if Lincoln wins, you really need to stay and accept the results of the election. That's tough medicine. I mean, it's the kind of thing that could have gotten him killed, just on a personal, physical level. But certainly that wasn't helping him in the presidential race in any way. So he believed very strongly in what Lincoln was trying to do. And so what would a Douglas presidency have looked like? I mean, Douglas certainly a very capable human being, considered a great statesman. He was the youngest person to have pretty much every job he had coming up, either as state's attorney, which is what we call county prosecutors in Illinois, or on the Illinois Supreme Court, a congressman, a senator, a guy who's talked about as a candidate for president and winning votes at conventions for president when he's in his early 30s. So really an exceptional and capable human being. And I think with Douglas as president, it's really hard to see the South seceding. Backing up, I'll tell you one of my favorite stories. So I did an event at President Lincoln's cottage in Washington, D.C., which is a historic site where I sit on the board of advisors. And I did an event with Michael Beschloss talking about this book. And usually before events, I'll go out and I'll mingle with everybody. I would have loved the chance to have said hello to all of you in person and been able to chat with you guys. And I usually do that before events. But Beschloss wanted to hang out in the green room beforehand. So that was one event where I was like, well, an hour alone with Beschloss or meet and greet. Sorry, everybody, I'm doing the hour alone in the green room with Beschloss. And so it was a great conversation, very memorable conversation. Obviously, such an interesting guy to spend an hour with. And as soon as we get out in this event, which is held in the room where Abraham Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, as soon as we get into the room with this event, could the Civil War have been prevented? No warning and no heads up gives me one of the most difficult, complicated questions in American history with no warning. So I think about it. And actually, I think if popular sovereignty, which is Douglas's plan to let territories decide for themselves whether to be free or slave, if popular sovereignty had been allowed to work, it's really hard to see where that spark would have come from to ignite the Civil War, right? If Douglas is going to let states decide for themselves, that's very different from Lincoln's position, which is that all of our territories are going to be free and there aren't going to be any new slave states or slave territories. So Douglas's position would have been an acceptable one to the South. And really, if he had gotten his way on popular sovereignty, then states would have decided for themselves. And, Americans were pretty good at living with the decisions and the outcomes of elections, even when they're not the way we would have wanted them. people choosing for themselves in free elections. And so it's hard to see how that spark ever comes to ignite the Civil War, at least in Douglas's time. Of course, we have to assume that Douglas lives a lot longer than he does, right? Otherwise, his vice president becomes president very early in his term, and who knows what would have happened. That's an interesting question. I think if he had lived, I think Douglas would have ended up being the leader of the war Democrats. And I think Lincoln would have had a lot more support among the Democrats. There would have been a faction of Democrats trying to support Lincoln that was greater than ultimately happened, because they would have had Douglas leading them. Yeah, other questions?
We do have a couple in chat. Let's see. Oh,
Yeah,
first,
great.
are your books available on Kindle or ebooks?
All of them on Kindle.
Nice. Okay, good. Let's see. So
Okay.
Lisa writes, oh, sorry.
I just want to say, because Chris had mentioned a lot about Lincoln as a congressman, and Congressman Lincoln, I think, is my favorite book of his. So you should really read that one, only because he takes such a really interesting look at Lincoln as a congressman when we all think of him just as a president. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Awesome.
Yeah,
So now you have,
that was a fun project to write. You know, when Lincoln becomes president, he'd only ever had one job in the federal government, and that was a single term as congressman. And so there really was no authoritative treatment of it. And it was a great, 16,000 books on Lincoln, and I got to write the one about him as a congressman. I just got, sometimes you get lucky in this business. Sometimes you have a great idea and you rush to Amazon to see if someone else wrote it. And, I found out, like the other day, I found out the OSS, which is the forerunner to the CIA. It's like our intelligence service during World War II. They actually taken a Major League Baseball player and used him as an undercover operative to infiltrate Germany. And, and I guess there's going to be a movie about it with Paul Rudd. Someone beat me to the book by a couple of years. I was like, this is such a cool idea. Normally, you get to Amazon, someone wrote the book. In this case, that was wide open. So thank you, Amy. That was a fun book to write about Congressman Lincoln.
so Lisa asks, well, first she says, it sounds like South Carolina tried seceding much earlier than I realized. So was new to her. And then also, could you give a couple of examples of what the ex-president said publicly during the war? And did Lincoln ever kind of say back to them, hey, you're not helping us? You're not helping.
That's a good question. So they all spoke out publicly during the war. Van Buren encouraged people to join the Union Army and answer Lincoln's call for troops after Fort Sumter. Fillmore did that routinely. He would go out and give speeches and support Lincoln's war efforts. Pierce was giving speeches right away. If the South wants to leave, let them leave. This is the North's fault for stoking the fires of abolition. If they want to leave, let them leave. And Buchanan really blessed Lincoln's efforts to try to respond militarily to the alleged secession of these southern states. Interestingly, the closest the United Kingdom ever comes to going to war against the United States is when we stopped an English vessel to seize two Confederate ambassadors who claimed they were the ambassadors going to Europe to try to get recognition for the CSA. We stopped an English vessel to do that, and we actually did their job for them way better than they could have for themselves. And we nearly brought the UK into the war. It was really, you miss 19th century UK, messing with them on the high seas, not good. And Millard Fillmore writes like the 6-page letter to Lincoln, telling him how to name, like Lincoln doesn't even acknowledge it. Just never writes back to him. So I'm sure he read it or had it read to him. I'm sure he was aware of the letter, but there's no response. He's not interested in what these guys have to say. Even Fillmore, who was probably the former president that he respected the most, right? Lincoln campaigned very hard for the Taylor-Fillmore ticket. Actually, I talk about this in Congressman Lincoln. There's really a point in history where Lincoln is kind of the campaign manager for Zachary Taylor in 1848. So he stays over the summer in DC to kind of help oversee the national Whig campaign for president. And people keep having to leave, either to go campaign for re-election or do things in their state. And then for a while, it's just Lincoln there at like Whig headquarters in DC running the presidential campaign. So Lincoln had actually campaigned very hard for the Taylor-Fillmore ticket. At this point, he's just not interested in what these guys have to say, not really. And so they're all very outspoken. I neglected to say Tyler. Tyler in addition to advocating for secession, he joins the first Confederate Congress and speaks out, condemning Lincoln, calling for the breakup of the Union. After the Battle of Bull Run, John Tyler says, now is the time to march on Washington. Forget building up our defenses in Virginia and elsewhere. We've defeated them at Bull Run, onto Washington, onto the Capitol. So you have a former president of the United States arguing for the capture of the American Capitol. And who knows, the Capitol could have been very vulnerable to an attack at that point in history if Tyler's words had been heeded. And so Lincoln had, we talk about today about the appropriate role of ex-presidents and when it's right to weigh in and not. There's actually an op-ed I wrote for the Washington Post, which was a cover of the B section on a Sunday edition. Very long op-ed talking about the role of other presidents. If you Google Chris DeRose, Lincoln's Other War, you'll find the Washington Post op-ed where I talk about it. But it was just a totally unprecedented intervention into public life by these former presidents. Oh, and then South Carolina. You asked about South Carolina.
Yes.
South Carolina is said to be too small for a republic, but too big to be an insane asylum. Apologies to anyone from the Palmetto State, but it's a place where they're causing a lot of trouble at this point in history. I begin the book by talking about Andrew Jackson and South Carolina's attempt to nullify the federal tariff. Jackson says, if you guys try any funny business, I'm going to go down to South Carolina and I'm going to hang you guys from every tree that I can find. So he actually threatens a military response against Congress to adopt a bill authorizing him to use force against South Carolina. So that's actually where I start the book, because it's the first time where you have a state saying we're gonna declare independence because we don't like this federal law. Jackson said, yeah, you go ahead and try it and watch what happens. So it's really where I think this debate begins that ultimately gets resolved by Abraham Lincoln. There's a toast where Jackson gets up at this toast during the height of the nullification crisis and says, the Union, it must be preserved. And he surprises everybody because he's a Southern slaveholder. He'd been seen as sympathetic to their interest in states' rights. But actually Jackson was a committed Unionist for all his faults. The other toast given at this dinner, one by the Vice President, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the leading exponent of nullification. And he says, the Union next to our liberties most dear, right? Next to the South's peculiar version of liberty, the Union is second place. Van Buren says, he's Vice President, he's right, the grand compromiser. Van Buren says, hey, remember that the genius of this country, we have so many people living under this diverse umbrella, is because we were always able to compromise. So let's not let our ability to compromise fail us here. And so those to me were really the three paths that dominated the antebellum era. We'll keep the Union together if we get our way, was the South's position. Van Buren says, hey, we can work it out, right? We can compromise our way out of this. That's the dominant position until Lincoln gets in. And then Jackson's position is, we're going to have the Union no matter what you think. The Union, it must be preserved. And so, yeah, South Carolina had been threatening to, and then during the Fillmore presidency, South Carolina threatens to leave the Union again because they believe that they'd gotten the lesser end of the bargain in the Compromise of 1850. And Fillmore actually moves troops into the region and says, I'm ready to go. And they back down. And so Fillmore, really a badly underrated president who really steps up to the occasion when his moment came. But yeah, South Carolina really been the one causing problems in this antebellum era, and ultimately would be the first to claim that it had seceded from the Union.
I don't know why I was not aware of that before. That is really interesting.
Thank you.
A lot more than I've never heard all of that backstory. Always sort of had the idea that somehow it had been bubbling for a long time, and then but then it really began in 1860, and that's clearly not what happened. So
South Carolina had been threatening to leave for 32 years before.
32 years. That is fascinating. Okay.
During the War of 1812, Massachusetts was threatening the same thing.
Right.
I wouldn't say that. I would say that there were people in the Northeast that had a really half-hearted, lukewarm effort to secede, but it really didn't go anywhere. So there are people who talked about it and thought about it in the Northeast, right? But it never it never really the South goes farther than that in the 1840s and 1850s by having conventions and regional meetings to discuss secession. I mean, the Northeastern effort really is half-hearted and lukewarm and really doesn't attract many big names behind it. So I think if you compare the secession efforts, you know, by region, I mean, certainly the War of 1812 is very unpopular in the Northeast, but really you don't have states meeting and threatening to leave the Union or trying to cause a face-off with the U.S. military or the president. You know, that doesn't really get that far.
Once the war started, can you hear me? Once the war started, Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe at a social gathering, and his response was, or to her, meeting her, he said, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." What is your opinion on her impact with her wonderful, wonderful book and published in 1850?
Yeah, so in the President's War, I'm going to butcher this quote, but I had a really good quote that I used to describe the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was like the best-selling book in American history to that point. Like it had sold like 300,000 copies like in its first run. And they had printing presses going day and night to publish the book. And so the quote I use that I'm going to butcher here that's in the book, which is basically talks about how potent art is when it's married to a political ideal. So you have a political ideal, that's great, but if you marry it to a form of art, then you've really got fire. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin really think about how easy it is. Think about how easy it is for someone who's only ever lived in the North. Most people in American history are living very close to where they were born. It's still true to this day. Imagine what it was like in the antebellum era. People are living close to where they're born. You know, people really didn't remember slavery when it was legal in the North. It's not really the same kind of deal. So this is really a new perspective on what's happening to real human beings, millions of human beings throughout the South. And so really it will, really the sentiment, the idea that book had set the country on a collision course to war is it's a legitimate one, right? Because you've got people in the North who just can't abide the fact that human beings are living like this and being treated this way in their country, that they have to do something about it. It's an incredible example of artwork being used to completely change the dynamic on an important political issue.
Another question in the chat from David. Was there any sentiment to prosecute the former presidents for treason? He says, I'm referring to those who express sympathy for the Confederate cause.
So the closest it comes, so the short answer is no. But Franklin Pierce, because he's so outspoken, right, against the war, speaking out against people joining the war, certainly people had been jailed during the war for saying less than Franklin Pierce said. Seward accuses him of being a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which is a paramilitary terrorist organization, clandestine outfit supporting the Confederacy. And Seward will end up with egg on his face and have to walk the comments back. But if indeed Pierce had been found to have been affiliated with these unsavory individuals, I think he could have been in real trouble. And so there was no effort really to lock them up for treason, but Pierce really comes the closest, and he does have that very public dust up with the administration where they start to make noise about what he's doing and what he might be involved with.
Wow.
But you wouldn't have heard lock him up at a Lincoln rally. That's what you're
Question about Buchanan's cabinet member, Jefferson Davis, who was Secretary of War. Did he leverage that position to enhance the South militarily?
So in the Buchanan administration, Jefferson Davis is in the Senate.
Oh, okay.
So he's Pierce's Secretary of War.
Okay.
He's in the Senate during Buchanan's administration. But Buchanan's Secretary of War, when the secession crisis begins, does try to turn Southern arsenals over to secessionists. And so there is an effort within the Buchanan cabinet to try to direct U.S. military resources to the secessionists. And so Buchanan ultimately, and maybe belatedly, does fire these secessionist sympathizers from the cabinet. But yeah, we lose some weapons, we lose some material because of members of Buchanan's cabinet who were disloyal to the United States. One of whom, Howell Cobb, just got his picture removed from the House of Representatives. He was also a former Speaker of the House. And he was serving in the Buchanan cabinet. And for his disloyalty, he actually has just had his picture removed from the House.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And which was the president that actually ended up serving in the Confederate?
That was John Tyler. So John Tyler will serve in the Virginia Secession Convention, and then he's a member of the Confederate Congress, where he really focuses on trying to prepare Virginia's defenses and the Confederate offensive capability. And of course, he's the one who wants to march on DC after the Battle of Bull Run. Of course, he'll die in 1862. He dies early in the war.
That's what he gets. See, that's what you get.
That's what I would have rather he lived to see the CSA serve out its whole 4-year existence.
That's right. Yeah.
Then he could die. But alas, his wife got to see it, and she actually got chased out of New York for her believed and real Southern sympathies.
Sounds like a familiar story.
Yeah.
So it sounds like Pierce was such a puzzle for a New Hampshire man went to Boston. So what do you fathom out of him?
So I think he just didn't have like that chip inside of him that made him feel anything about slavery. I just don't think he cared. I don't think he saw it as his problem. I don't think he saw it as something that was ever in his purview. In his mind, he was like a Southerner. And so he just didn't have that chip that makes the rest of us and made millions of Americans revile at the prospect of a man owning another person or treating that person in a brutal and inhumane way. It just didn't affect him. And so I think that was, so what is the big deal here? Why would we ever trade the prosperity that we have in this country, this unprecedented union, to appease some malcontents in the North who are mad about something that isn't even their business?
How did the people in New Hampshire react to him, though, during the time? They must have been very upset.
Yes. There were always pockets of traditional Democratic support in the North that were opposed to the war, skeptical of the war effort. But yeah, generally speaking, Pierce is going to become a pariah, first in the rest of the country and eventually in his home state. Remember, they'd sent him to the U.S. Senate on that position,
Any other questions for Chris? Go ahead.
I just thought it was unbelievable Hollywood that the Monitor arrived the day after the CSS Virginia attacked at Norfolk. Was that the hand of God?
I think there's a lot of examples of divine providence, and I'm certainly a believer in that. And I think to be a historian, sometimes you have to be. I actually write an entire chapter about that probably has no business in this book, called Greenbacks and Ironclads. But it was only a couple of pages, and I said, what the heck, and I left it in. But it probably doesn't do much to advance the narrative of 5 former presidents in the Civil War, but alas.
It's good information to have.
It's in there. I kind of wanted the book to be like a decent primer on the Civil War, too. I wanted people who'd never read a full book about the Civil War to have a primer, to be able to read it and say, I have a good idea of what happened and when. So I talk a little bit about major battles and things that happened in the war. And hopefully it worked well for people. And hopefully people who were already very familiar with the war and just wanted to learn about this new and lesser explored political side of things, forgive me for the indulgence there. It's always a balance, right? You're trying to appeal to both people.
I'm gonna buy it.
Yes, everybody go and buy it. And the old ones and the new one upcoming.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'm happy to hang out and take as many questions as you guys have. So this is fun for me and hopefully fun for you guys as well. And we're all stuck in quarantine. So
well, Chris, maybe you can tell them about your upcoming book, because I will say it's my second favorite one after Congressman Lincoln. Yes.
Congressman Lincoln's better than the Fighting Bunch?
Yes.
You really like that book. So the Fighting Bunch is about this event in American history where these World War II veterans come back and they find that a corrupt political machine is in charge of their hometown. So during the war years, the elections had been stolen through violence and fraud. In fact, according to the U.S. Attorney General, these were the worst allegations of voter fraud that had ever been presented to the Department of Justice. And so these guys have been off fighting for freedom. They come back to a corrupt political machine running their hometown. They come back to police brutality, where police are compensated based on how many people they can arrest. So some of them are getting arrested on the bus coming home from war and getting their mustering out pay stolen by the people who are sworn to protect and defend them. And they're finding they come back to the bad timeline and Back to the Future too. There's open casinos, open gambling, and houses of prostitution. It's just a bad deal. But they say, this is America. We know what we've been fighting for. So they formed this nonpartisan all veterans ticket, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They run on a GI ticket against the machine. On election day, the machine isn't going peacefully. They recruit hundreds of gunmen to help steal the election. A small group of these veterans at the end of the day will stand up and demand a fair count of the ballot boxes, which are being held in the jail. When they are refused this most basic right that they have fought for, there's a 6-hour firefight. And the county government of McMinn County, Tennessee is successfully overthrown. So you have the first successful rebellion in American history since the American Revolution. So these guys succeeded where all previous rebellions had failed. It's just an incredible story of these World War II veterans who have to fight one last battle and liberate their hometown. That's called The Fighting Bunch, and it's available for pre-order. And hopefully y'all will buy it, and I'll be able to come visit you guys and see your wonderful museum in person, and we'll get to talk about it.
What's the name of the county in Tennessee?
McMinn.
McMinn.
So it's in between Chattanooga and Knoxville.
Okay.
I mean, to be fair, it's only my second favorite because I like presidential history. So that's
It's
why
true.
Lincoln is above that. But The Fighting Bunch is a really great book. And it's one of those obscure stories that Chris has rooted out in history. And he does a really great job telling it. So
Yeah, if there were 10 million more people who read presidential history like Amy, I could afford to still write books about the presidents. But I've been trying to aim at a broader target with these last 2 books.
Chris, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
Yes.
dying to read one of your books at least. And I think I might start with Lincoln in the Senate, in whatever it's called. The one you just mentioned, the first one.
Congressman Lincoln?
Yes. I'm just wondering, with all the research that you must do, I can't imagine writing these books, but are you still practicing law while you're doing this?
No, so when I wrote my first book, I didn't have enough money. I didn't get enough money from the sale of my first book to just quit and do it full time for a year. So I practiced as little law as possible, and I wrote as much as I could. I sold my second book to Simon & Schuster, and then I started getting royalties for the first book, which was very successful, and I was able to turn my attention really to writing full time. And that was about the time in my career where I became a law professor, and that's a very complimentary position, right? You're in a classroom 7 hours a week. You don't work summers. You have every conceivable break off. Your students are studying for finals. You're not doing anything. So it's a really complimentary position. And then my 4th and 5th books I wrote full time. It really is tough to do anything else when you're writing these books. And this is what I want to do. I like researching. I like writing. I like storytelling. I like coming and doing events like this with people like you guys. And so this is what I prefer to be doing. And so practicing very little law right now. It would have to be I think I've taken 2 cases on in the last year.
How long did it take you to do the research for this book and to write it?
Somehow it always takes me about 6 months, no matter the subject, to come up with a first draft. And maybe that's because of how long they give me. But yeah, it takes about 6 months to get a manuscript. The magic is in the editing. going back and forth. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone over the fighting bunch now, maybe 5 or 6 times. And then, you know, a team of copy editors goes over it. Then you have your editor, you have fact-checkers, you have a whole team of people who read it, and you go back and forth with them. So the magic's really in the editing, not in the writing. And then I'm researching right until I hit send on the manuscript. Really right until, oh, this would be interesting to know about. This would be interesting to include. Researching right to the last minute.
Thank you.
It's just so much fun. Yeah, more questions from me.
More questions or anything else?
Chris, do you ever feel the need to resist the temptation to draw too strong a parallel between what you read about or study in the past and what's happening now?
I try very hard to avoid shoehorning parallels that don't exist.
Yeah.
First of all, I think there are enough parallels that do exist that we have plenty of time to talk about those and focus on those. And those are always there. Nothing ever surprises me in terms, you know, on a historic level, right? People have pretty much been the same throughout history. Every era I've studied, every country I've studied, there's certain things that are the same about people. There's certain things that are the same about people who exist in societies and how they relate to one another and what happens in countries, what happens in politics. You know, we're not living through anything new now. You know, I think everyone's very surprised. I mean, it's a 100-year pandemic, but it's not the first pandemic. So, you know, we've got historical examples of what pandemics and epidemics looked like in American history and what we did and what we could do better. And hopefully future generations will profit from our experience. Because right now this isn't going to be a positive, you know, it's not going to be a positive case study in history of what went right. It's going to look a lot more like that first year of the Civil War where we did everything wrong. So yeah, it does bother me. Usually historians want to shoehorn exactly what, like someone wrote an article in the Atlantic about how the French Revolution is exactly like what's happening now. And I just went through it and it was like, either none of that's happening now or that didn't really happen in the French Revolution. Like you're just trying to connect this because that's what you study. Like you're trying to connect things that you study to the present day, but it's not relevant. Like maybe you could find something, but you didn't in this article. So I really do try to avoid, you know, that, but I think the past is full of lessons and there are very good parallels. And I try very hard to let the story do the work and let the people in the story speak for themselves and to really not sledgehammer people with the conclusions. My readers are smart people and they'll draw their own conclusions about what's similar to today and what's not.
Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was fabulous.
Is that everybody?
I really appreciate it.
This was a lot of fun for me. Thank you guys so much.
Good.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Laura, for being such great hosts.
Thank
Tell
you.
that after I read the book, I will have a
Yep.
lot more questions.
I expect you to have them.
I need to read it first, and then I know I'm gonna have a ton of questions. Because a lot of the information is new, but it's so interesting.
Well, thank you.
I'm gonna have 100 questions after I read it.
You're all welcome to contact me through my website. So my website is chrisderosebooks.com. There's a contact feature. It comes right to my email. And so if you have a question that you didn't get to ask today, or if you read something in one of my books and you want to drop me a line, please feel free. I'd be glad to read it and I'd be happy to respond.
That's awesome.
Thank
Very
you.
generous of you. Thank you.
This is fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good work, Amy.
Thank you all.
Good night. Thank you.
Alrighty.
Hope to see you in 2 weeks at our next lecture. More information on the website. Take care, everybody.
Night.
Bye.
Thanks
Good night.
again.